All right, so we only have 2 weeks left of our New Testament survey this year. We've actually cleared out and already passed the New Testament though. So at the beginning of the year, we did our intertestamental period of time, which is what lands between the Old Testament and the New Testament, because there's 400 years of history there. Went through the life and ministry of Jesus, and then we went through the period of the Acts of the Apostles, covered the book of Revelation, and now we are doing church history so that we understand why we have Lutherans and Catholics and Episcopalians and Orthodox churches and Baptists and Presbyterians and all kinds of other churches present in the world today. And we're doing a much more expansive version of church history than you usually get in the West. So looking forward, this is our fourth installment of church history tonight. Next week we'll conclude it with the history from 1600 to the present day, roughly. Mother's Day is May 10th, and we will not have Foundations for Faith that day. And then on the 17th of May is our graduation ceremony and started in the service in the morning. And so that would be 10:15 in the morning for those of you who are able to make it. And you're just finishing your first year, right? So you will be up for graduating, and
Are you gonna
a
stay
few
home?
others.
We'll see.
Hmm.
For
Yeah.
next year.
Next year, that's the
No,
Old
I
Testament.
mean like on graduation. You should
Oh,
still
yeah.
come.
Yep.
Cause I don't want it to just be me, Ariana, and Will.
We usually have a good turnout for graduation,
Yeah.
so.
You have to send me a card.
I'm just kidding.
Yes.
I'm not
I'll
making
be there.
cards.
I'll
There
be
you
there.
go.
I'll draw you a little card with a stick figure on it.
Anyway, we will discuss the plans for the afternoon to celebrate, and then for those coming back, next fall we'll kick off at the Old Testament again and start the third round of Foundations for Faith. Invite all the ninth graders that we know of to come in and join us if they're interested, and graduates that missed a few lessons can fill in some of the gaps if they want. But without further ado, let's jump into the fourth installment of church history. So we've been looking at the various different strands of history of the church, and by the year 1200 we have 5 distinctly different strands of the church. You've got the Roman Catholic Church, you've got the Eastern Orthodox Church, which is based out of Constantinople, or the Byzantine Empire. You've got the Pilgrim Church, which is kind of like the non-denominational churches of Europe in the day. They were neither Orthodox nor Catholic. And you have Oriental Orthodox churches, which split off in 451 AD, and those were the ones found in Armenia and Syria, Egypt, and Ethiopia. And then further over to the east, you have the Church of the East, which was based in the Persian Empire and took the gospel all the way over to India, through Central Asia, China, Mongolia, and those are the 5 major strands of the church. So, jumping into the first part of one of the strands that is wrapped up by this point in time is the Celtic Church. This was founded by Patrick way back about 1,000 years earlier almost. And by the year 1200, the Celtic Church had largely been assumed and assimilated into the Roman Catholic Church. It was based out of Ireland and had moved into Scotland, parts of England, and between 800 and 1200, most of it was now under the jurisdiction of the Roman Catholic Church. There were just a few remote areas, distant islands, that continued practicing it, but as the Catholic Church grew in power in the British Isles, they actually were aggressively oppressing those who'd want to stick around with the Celtic traditions. So, into the 1300s, you have a few people practicing with the Celtic traditions, and by and large the church in the British Isles is now Roman Catholic. So this is a period of time when the Roman Catholic Church actually peaks in its power and influence. We had the 3 Crusades in the previous century. In 1202, the 4th Crusade is announced by the Pope, and the crusade was supposed to lead to the liberation of Jerusalem. The army got sidetracked along the way. Somebody bribed them with promises of great riches and wealth if they instead would take the city of Constantinople and help him regain the throne there. And so the Crusader army, instead of going to Jerusalem, went to Byzantium or Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. They sacked the city there because they were looking for wealth, and that had some serious impacts on the relationship between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. It was also about this time, though, that some of the monastic orders that were a little more aggressive in missions started arising in the Catholic Church. One was the Franciscan order. Perhaps you've heard of a guy by the name of Francis of Assisi. He was known for his extreme poverty that he would live by. So he had very few, if any, possessions other than a walking stick and his clothes, I think. But he was always looking out for helping the poor, even though he himself was very poor, and ministering to their needs. And then of a similar nature, but a different organization, was the Dominican order in the Catholic Church, founded by Dominic de Guzman, who I believe was a Frenchman. And these two orders end up having a little bit more of a missionary bent to them, as opposed to the Benedictine monasteries that had been in the Catholic Church up to this point in time. So the Catholic Church is like right in its heyday through the 1200s and is influencing all the politics of Europe and the like, launching crusades. There were actually 4 more crusades, 5 through 8 were a little less in significance though. And then we have a crisis arise in the Catholic Church. In 1307, Clement V, he was the Archbishop in Bordeaux, France. He was elected to be Pope by the conclave of that day. And he refused to move to Rome, and instead stopped in Avignon, France, and this is what becomes known as the Avignon Papacy. And so it's a real aberration in the history of the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church usually was headquartered in Rome, in the Vatican City, but for a good 70 years here, it was actually found, or the Pope and all of his assistants and such were found in Avignon, France, which meant that it was much more heavily influenced by the French king than normal, and so there was some of that to it. After 70 years, though, Gregory the 11th moves it back to Rome. He dies like the next year or 2 years later, and then it creates a schism because they have a crisis as to who is actually the Pope. So you have rival popes aligned now, one in Rome and one back in Avignon, France. And this lasts for about 40 years, with rival claimants leading the church, and eventually they call a council. It was called the Council of Constance in 1417. Everybody agrees Martin V will be the Pope, and so everybody else were denounced as anti-popes. Not to be confused with antichrists, but anti-popes. So that brought unity back into the Catholic Church, but the 1400s then proved to be a period of pretty significant corruption in the Catholic Church. And this corruption ends up leading to the Protestant Reformation, because people were realizing this maybe is not what the scriptures are talking about. Specifically, in 1517, Martin Luther, it was like a seminary student of some sorts. He's a relatively young guy at the time. He has 95 theses that he writes up, and he nails them to the door of a church leader in Württemberg, I believe. And he was analyzing and looking at the practice of indulgences. And this was something that fed the corruption of the Roman Catholic Church. So you had this teaching in the church that you can reduce the time that you have to spend in penance, or some of your time in purgatory, by giving money to the church, giving money to the poor, and essentially by some grace to lead a sinful life. And so Martin Luther was looking at that, and he was finding that the scriptures really don't support this process of selling indulgences to people to try and gain the forgiveness of sins. And that was what provoked his 95 Theses. And all of a sudden, instead of just being a theological discussion between a seminary student and a professor, it becomes this huge movement because other people are coming to the similar conclusions and wanting to reform the Catholic Church and change it. So the three main leaders of the Reformation, there were plenty of other leaders as well, though, were Martin Luther, John Calvin, and a guy by the name of Huldrych Zwingli. And they end up leading his Reformation that changes the nature of the church pretty substantially, and they actually revolt against the Roman Catholic authority in the church. And there were three themes by which the Protestants were preaching and gathering people to their cause. And of course it was in Latin, because everything theological in those days was done in Latin. And so the three solae were the rally cry of the Reformation: sola scriptura, sola fide, and sola gratia. Sola scriptura was significant because this is the idea that the will of the Lord and the Word of God is revealed to us by the Scriptures alone. And that was a revolution from the Catholic approach to it, because the Catholics believed that you have what the Bible says, but you also have church traditions, which held an extraordinary amount of authority. And then you also have what the Pope says, who was considered to be infallible when he was speaking for God. And so, whereas the Catholic Church held these three things as being authoritative and good reason to choose to do this, that, or the other thing, the Protestants said, no, we are only going to gain our authority out of what the Scriptures say. Then sola fide was in relation to how we are actually saved. And the Catholic practice of indulgences, the idea was essentially like you can do good things to earn your salvation as well as believe and have faith. And the Reformationists realized, no, the Scriptures say that we are saved by our faith alone. Our works count for nothing. They are good to do by all means, but they don't gain anything in our salvation. And then sola gratia is that we are saved by the grace of God alone. He didn't even have to save us or grant salvation, but he did by his grace, which is an unmerited favor that we get from him. So these three ideas, which seem foundational to us in the Western church today, if we're not in the Catholic Church, were revolutionary in their day. That the Scriptures would be the sole authority for the church, that faith would be the basis of our salvation through the grace of God alone, and that our works and actions would not factor into that, was quite revolutionary, and it provoked a huge, strong response all across Europe. And one thing that I'll point out that really fed this is that just 75 years earlier, the printing press had been invented, and so that allowed ideas to transmit around Europe much faster than just itinerant preachers. And so that fed the fan and the flames of the Reformation quite a bit. Now, as an oddball tacked onto this, we have the formation of the Anglican Church. It's sometimes known as the Episcopalian Church. There are some around in the area, but they're not as common in this area. But this is essentially the organized Church of England. And Henry VIII was trying to have a male heir, and he kept having daughters instead of sons, and so he kept thinking it was his wife's fault. He didn't realize it was his problem. And so he wanted a new wife, and the Catholic Church was not going to grant him the divorce that he was requesting. And so he's like, I'm going to join the Reformationists, because then the Pope doesn't matter for anything, and I'll just create my own church and he'll be the head of the church. And that is what he did. So he was more just being an opportunistic leader at the time. And so the Episcopalian Church or Anglican Church and the Roman Catholic Church are very, very, very similar in lots of different ways. The Anglicans just jumped ship because Henry VIII wanted to get a divorce.
Didn't they make a movie about that?
Oh yeah, Henry VIII is like great fodder for movies.
One of the more
Yeah,
infamous.
yep. When it comes to English monarchs, he gets a lot more attention than just about everybody else
King George
combined.
III, King
Mhm.
Henry VIII.
Wait, who's the guy that had eight wives?
That was King Henry VIII.
Oh,
Yep.
Is it just 6?
wait, actually?
He had a lot of wives. I'm not sure how many it was. Yes,
6.
he kept trying to get a new wife to produce a son,
He
and
wanted
it
a
was
son,
not working.
and it took him 6 wives.
Mhm.
finally
To
get
figure out that it was his fault.
Well, he never knew that scientifically speaking, because they didn't understand the XY chromosome issue. So, anyhow, so this is what launches the Protestant Reformation, and the Anglican Church is tacked on as an oddball. But within just a couple generations, you have Protestant churches all across Europe. And there's a lot of overlap with Catholic churches in some of these countries, but some countries almost wholesale shifted away from the Catholic Church. So Germany at this time was not a unified country. It was about 36 different principalities, and each prince would make a decision as to whether he wanted to shift to go Lutheran or stay Catholic. And whatever they decided is what all the churches in their land and domain became. And sometimes it was more politically motivated or heavily motivated by taxes, honestly, than anything else, because the Roman Catholic Church had lots of assets and acquired lots of taxes from governments and their domains. And this actually prompted the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, to all jump ship off the Catholic Church and become Lutheran because they wanted to have to send less money down to Rome. So that is why Scandinavians by and large are Lutheran. And who settled the upper Midwest? Scandinavians. So in the upper Midwest we have more Lutheran churches than any other part of the entire country. But that's not the only one. You have the Dutch Reformed Church in the Netherlands. You have the Swiss Reformed Church out of Switzerland. In France, you had a group of people called the Huguenots. They were Reformationists as well. In France, though, they were heavily persecuted because the king never shifted to becoming a Protestant. They stayed Catholic, and so Protestants in France were really, really violently persecuted. I think they were guillotined a lot, honestly.
Guillotine didn't come about till
That wasn't
later.
until later.
It
Okay.
was like, we're gonna go to war against the Huguenots, and then a violent civil war, and they just like massacred 20,000 of them.
Yep. Up in Scotland, there was another preacher, and he started what became known as the Presbyterian Church. And then, as I mentioned, in England, we had the Anglican Church. And so you end up with this interesting patchwork of church affiliations that are associated with national identities and ethnicities. And that actually heavily influences the United States today based on which ethnicities out of Europe emigrated and settled into an area. So in Baldwin, there was lots of Dutch people that settled here, and lo and behold, we have First Reformed Church and we have Christian Reformed Church, because they were Dutch Reformed when they moved over here. And anywhere the Dutch settled in the United States, which includes Michigan and northeastern Iowa, you usually have a high concentration of Reformed churches, but not necessarily in other places. Now the Reformation in the Europe influenced the Catholic Church, and they ended up reacting by having a counter-reformation, and this did end up cleaning up a lot of corruption in the Catholic Church. They called the church council to make lots of decisions, and that church council met for 18 years. It's known as the Council of Trent, made lots of decisions, but they solidified their hold on Catholic theology and agreed we do still believe all the things we used to believe, in spite of what the Reformationists are preaching and saying. And this is also about the period of time that the Jesuit order in the Catholic Church started becoming more significant as well. Now at the same time that you've got all this Reformation going on in Europe and all this upheaval in the Catholic Church, there's another thing that's happening, because who rediscovered the Americas in 1492?
Christopher Columbus.
Christopher Columbus.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and what country was he from?
Spain? No.
Spain.
Spain.
Well,
He was sailing for the Spanish crown. He was actually an Italian.
Okay.
Okay. I was
Yep,
gonna say
Yep,
Spanish.
and then there was another lesser known explorer who was Portuguese. His name was Vasco da Gama, and he discovered the route to India in 1493. So Portugal and Spain were not at the center of the Reformation, and they were still very firmly Catholic. And as they discovered all these territories and trade routes, all of a sudden you have this massive colonial expansion, and they took the Catholic Church with them. And so in the Portuguese Empire, or the Spanish Empire, you've got all the Central American countries of today, from Mexico on down and across the Caribbean. And then you have the South American countries of Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, and Peru on the Pacific side, Argentina down further south, Portuguese Empire included Brazil, and then they also had connections over in India and various places too. And this is kind of a complicated period of history because they were coming and conquering all the natives in the Americas. They weren't able to conquer places in India quite as handily. And one of the reasons for that is because they took disease with them to the Americas, which killed off 95 to 98% of the natives that lived in the Americas in 1491. And so it was a very serious dieback that would make the Black Death in Europe seem relatively small in impact compared to what happened in the Americas. So that made it easier for them to conquer, but then they also had a massive process of conversion. And one of the things to remember is that as Spanish and Portuguese explorers came, some of them were motivated by conquest, and some of them just simply brought church friars and priests and such along with them who were motivated to actually convert the natives and preach the gospel to them. And so you have a whole lot of mixed motives by the people who were actually coming over here. But conquest, disease, and conversion going hand in hand made for an interesting, troubled receiving end for all the natives, because they had to become Spanish, in essence, to become Christian, and that is a problem that will continue on throughout a lot of missions movements we'll see next week.
We need to do those videos for Black Death.
Yes.
Do you remember it? Did Ariana ever talk about it?
I remember hearing about the Black
I used
Death.
to wear a cone on my face because I was a doctor.
Funny.
Actually.
Yeah, Kylie was in my group and she was so mean about it. It's like,
We just got like eaten by rats and stuff.
yep, eaten by rats.
Yeah.
So shifting then to another strand in church history, away from the Catholic Church and the Protestant Reformation, there was a strand of churches that were essentially non-denominational. They didn't conform to the Orthodox Church, they didn't conform to the Roman Catholic Church, they completely eschewed or were averse to the idea of a strong hierarchy that led up to a single person who controlled the entire church. And we're calling that strand the Pilgrim Church based on the book that is written about it. They started in Turkey in the 600s, and they got forcibly emigrated over to Bulgaria, and then from Bulgaria they moved over to Bosnia. And in 1200, Bosnia was formerly a Catholic territory, and almost everybody had become this non-denominational belief at that point in time, and would not serve the interests of the Catholic Church and would not follow the practices that they had. And I was not able to develop this strand quite as thoroughly here for this week, but it spread through the Alps and then into the Pyrenees Mountains on the border between France and Spain. And the Catholic Church destroyed most of their documentation. So unfortunately what we know about these groups are usually written down or recorded by their enemies. And the Catholic Church considered them to be heretics and had all kinds of disparaging things to say about them, called them demon worshippers and everything of the sort. Most descriptions of their lifestyle would point to them actually having had true conversion experiences and living quite righteously, especially compared to the Catholics in the neighborhood. But anyway, so a few different names that they were known by as Catharists, Albigensians, and the Waldensians, and we'll look at those a little bit more perhaps next week. But the Catholic Church was not the only game in town, and actually as the Reformationists were starting to scatter and go across Europe preaching the Reformation, they actually would come across some of the valleys in the Alpine mountains, and they would come across Christian churches there, and they'd be like, when did the Reformation get here? I thought I was the first one. And the locals would be like, what are you talking about, a Reformation? We have been living and preaching this way since the Apostles. And that was a long-standing faith tradition that is underrepresented in history and relatively unknown, that just persisted amongst some of the rural areas in Europe that were not controlled by the Catholic Church. Now, shifting to the Eastern Orthodox strand of the church, jumping back here a little bit, you remember the Fourth Crusade was supposed to liberate Jerusalem, but it ends up instead sacking Constantinople. Well, that was the central point of the Eastern Orthodox Church, where the Patriarch of Constantinople led the entire Orthodox Church system, which by that time had moved into Ukraine and Russia, and was down in Greece and plenty of other territories as well. This seriously weakened the Byzantine Empire through which the Orthodox Church was ministering, and it also solidified the schism that had happened a couple hundred years earlier between the East and the West, because the Pope called for the crusade that ended up seriously damaging Constantinople. Ultimately, it led a couple hundred years later to the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which is when the Ottoman Empire, which were the Turks that now reside in Turkey, they had come over from Central Asia, and they sacked Byzantine Empire and conquered Constantinople, thus bringing the actual end to the Roman Empire. We call them Byzantines today, but the Byzantine Empire knew itself as the Roman Empire, and so the fall of Rome in some ways didn't even happen until 1453, when the last vestiges of the Roman Empire actually came crashing down. So as the Muslims had in other places, as soon as they took over Constantinople, they began to tax Orthodox Christians at an excessively high rate compared to Muslim inhabitants. That was their way of maintaining some measure of religious autonomy and also raising revenue. But this meant that the Russian Orthodox Church was the only relatively independent church in the Orthodox system, and this was centered out of Moscow. And so then the Russian Orthodox Church gained preeminence amongst the Orthodox family of churches. And they also then claimed that Moscow was the third Rome, the Western Roman Empire in Rome having fallen in 476, Constantinople then falling in 1453, so Moscow claims to be the heir of the Roman Empire. Kind of like Charlemagne claimed to be the heir of the Roman Empire. Everybody's looking back to Rome. So, strange happenings there. But the Eastern Orthodox Church then in Russia stagnated to an extent for a while until the Russian Empire began taking off, but that's after 1600, so we'll cover that next week. So then shifting over to the Oriental Orthodox Church strands, an interesting thing happened with the Armenian Apostolic Church. They had ebbs and flows throughout their history, but at the beginning of this period, they started up a new kingdom in Cilicia, and that actually is a region that comes across in the book of Acts. Does anybody remember where Cilicia was from, or where it is?
What country is Constantinople in?
There's like the
Turkey
Ottomans
today.
too, that might not-
Istanbul.
I didn't know that either.
Hmm?
I didn't know that either.
Which one, Constantinople? Or what Micaiah just said?
Constantinople.
Yep,
To be fair, we didn't really learn geography.
I know.
Is it the obvious Sicily or is it somewhere else?
No, it's not Sicily.
Okay.
Saul of Tarsus was from Cilicia.
You have 50 states that are.
So,
Tarsus.
Wait,
Actually,
can you
Canadian
name what it
Federal,
was?
I'm sorry.
Hmm?
Country?
the country is Armenia. The region is Cilicia. I'll just go to the map here. So this is zoomed in a little bit further, but yeah.
That's really
Helpful. So just to give you a context here, you've got Antioch here. This is the island of Cyprus. We've got the northeastern Mediterranean Sea. This region here is known as Cilicia. And it was Greek, generally speaking, but it kept shifting from one political hand to the next political hand. And from 1200 to 1375, the Armenians, which came from by the Caspian Sea, ended up having a kingdom that encompassed this whole area here. And the reason this worked is ironically because of the Crusades. The Muslims got pushed out of the neighborhood, and so the neighbors down here were two Crusader kingdoms, and that was a flank and a buffer between the Muslim caliphates. And then over to this side you have the Byzantine Empire, and I guess this is the Seljuk Turks here, and this is the Byzantine Empire. So the Armenians, they're not even in Armenia anymore, but they've got an Armenian kingdom going on, and the Armenian Apostolic Church just thrives here. Ironically, this is actually where the Pilgrim Church started, because they started in this neighborhood here 600 years earlier until they were forcibly moved over into Bulgaria. And so in this particular neck of the woods, you've got some of the craziest amount of church history, because it starts with Paul in the book of Acts, going around starting churches and ministering, and then you've got lots of different strands of church history overlapping in that one spot. But anyway, going back to the events that take place here. No, wrong direction. There we go. For almost 200 years, this Armenian kingdom is able to persist, and the church does really well in the period of peace at this time, and this lasts until 1375, when the Egyptian Muslims then march northward and they've conquered all the Crusader states, and then they wipe out this Armenian state too. And then once again you have cultural Christians that are subjugated by the Muslims, and they end up having to pay lots of taxes under the Muslim rule, and start going into a decline just because it is economically costly to remain Christian in faith. Whereas prior to this, they were able to ally with the Crusader states, and the Mongols actually helped them too. We'll get to the Mongols shortly. I know. The Mongols and church history.
Wait, like the Mongols?
Mongolians.
War?
Yep, I have a map for them too.
Where is Mongolia?
North of China,
Where's China?
a really long ways east from here.
Actually, hold on.
It's also a really long ways
More or
west
less.
from here.
Yeah. East from here is what I was meaning.
What country is that, like now, like is that?
Nowadays, this is Syria and Turkey. So this right here is roughly the border between Turkey to the north and Syria down here. Aleppo is,
Oh, it's like sandwiched in between Russia and China. That makes more sense now.
there you go.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
See, it's like it's got buddies.
Yep.
And then wait, where's
I was
Japan
too late.
and then South
Wait, Japan and Ireland?
Yep,
Yes.
Japan's
I
island.
never knew that. I learned it like last year. That it was an island. I was like, I don't know.
You know who had to tell me where Russia was? Mr. Scamper. In like math class, because we were talking about something, and I was like, I don't know where Russia is. And so he pulled up the whole map. Whole
One of
map.
the things I've concluded through this is I need to up my geography game, because I have very little to work with from middle school. So,
I know.
Sixth grade.
Yeah.
Middle
It's
school
okay.
sucks.
But that's like,
is the United Kingdom
Not
and
where.
Britain and England all the same thing?
almost not quite.
Memorize the
I'll
facts.
explain the difference.
Yeah.
It's
Not
really-
quite. I thought like
I'll explain the difference.
Also,
But not-
genuinely thought that Greenland was littler than Iceland. It is not.
Nope.
What are the
All right. So one other thing, while we're on a map here, I'll point out. So this is now modern day Syria, and this is also where the Syriac Church is based, which is one of the other Oriental Orthodox churches. So that's the region. They were doing poorly under the Crusader states because the Crusaders were Roman Catholics, and so they did not take very well to Oriental Orthodox churches, and so they suppressed the Syriac Orthodox Church. Crusader states get invaded by the Muslims, and the Muslims start oppressing and taxing the Oriental Orthodox Church there too. So the Syriac Orthodox Church gets really heavily marginalized and withers to almost nothing, but not quite nothing. They have just a handful of congregations left in Syria at the end of this period, but they are diminishing and declining because it is politically and religiously a very difficult climate for them. The same thing happens in Egypt. We remember where Egypt is?
so,
South of this area, yes.
Isn't it in
Africa, yep.
Okay.
So, but, yep, Egypt was invaded by the Muslims as well. And so you've got the Coptic church down there. It's named after what used to be the common language of Copt. So they would do their church services in the Coptic language. So it's known as the Coptic church. And it was also very heavily taxed and marginalized, but they do substantially better in Egypt as far as persisting. So they were not an expansive church. It was something that existed under the Muslim rule for another 400 years, centered out of Alexandria, and they also had several monastic communities. For some reason, people liked the idea of going off into the desert, founding a monastery at some oasis, and then trying to exist apart from the whole rest of the world.
You know what that reminds me of?
The North Slopes of Alaska?
The wise men and the nativity.
Oh,
pretty close.
I don't know where you're getting any of these today.
Yeah, I don't know, library's pretty far off today.
Like the soccer one. That one really did not make sense.
It was the vibe, you know?
Yes. Micaiah's connections are kind of crazy. Now, the last of the Oriental Orthodox churches we're going to touch on here is the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Ethiopia is a good deal south of Egypt, and the church in Egypt spread south into Ethiopia very early in the history of the church. Ethiopia, in the previous 400-year period, went through a political convolution, civil war. It collapsed and then reconstituted, and they had a shift here in the year 1270. They were being ruled by what was called the Zagwe dynasty, which actually was like a Jewish tribe that had come from Yemen, invaded across the Red Sea, and invaded all of Ethiopia. 1270, that dynasty gets overthrown by somebody claiming to be the descendant of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Not a lot of scientific support for that claim, but it worked really well because you had a Christian population that was very well versed in the Old Testament, and the Queen of Sheba was a person of import in that neighborhood of the world, and so to claim that descent and be Christian was enough to guarantee them political authority all the way to the year 1974. And the last of those Ethiopian emperors died. His name was Haile Selassie, I think. And
so like they got invaded by the Italians in World War II?
Yep, and the British put that guy back on the throne in 1940 or 1941. So this actually is getting to extraordinarily recent history here, but there was this interesting synergy between the ruling dynasty then and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, because they had a political connection back to Solomon in the Old Testament, and the church went back in the culture for almost about 1,000 years at this point in time, and so one gave the other credibility and authority, and vice versa. Now, in this stretch of time, there was a monastic movement in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, so they started founding monasteries in the Ethiopian highlands, and all the while they're doing liturgy or their church services in this Ge'ez language, which I have never heard. Anybody ever heard of the Ge'ez language before? Yep. And it's an ancient, probably now dead, but I'm not positive it's a dead language, but it goes back a ridiculously long time. Those churches, for some reason, never like to update their common language. And they existed completely cut off and isolated from almost every other church except Alexandria. They were closely connected with the Coptic Church until the 1500s. You guys remember who went off exploring in the Indian Ocean in the 1500s?
Christopher.
Nope, he went to the New World. He wasn't in the Indian Ocean.
I have no idea.
I don't either.
We did not know our history.
It's okay.
Prince Henry?
Portuguese, yes. Portuguese explorers went east and the Spanish explorers went west. And so in the Indian Ocean, you get to some of the ports that are Ethiopian ports, and so all these Portuguese explorers are exploring, and they come across Christians in Ethiopia that they didn't know existed. Now, most of their connections in Africa, they were finding various different kingdoms and tribes that were not Christian and had their various different languages and customs and rituals, and then all of a sudden they come across a Christian kingdom, which surprised them greatly. And that wasn't the only time the Portuguese discovered Christians in far-flung places of the world they didn't know they existed. But that finally ended about 1,200 years of isolation for this church. So it existed independently for about 1,200 years without any other geopolitical connection. So we've covered the Western Church and the Roman Catholic and the Protestant Reformation, and we've covered the Eastern Orthodox Church, and moving a little further east we have the Oriental Orthodox churches. Now we're going to shift over to another strand known as the Church of the East, which is really the Eastern Church. I don't know why all these churches are known by being east. I guess it's just we're so far west, probably. So the Church of the East had been was centered out of Persia and expanded into China a long time earlier in 635 AD. And they swept through China for a long time. And reviewing just a little bit, the Song dynasty took over power in China in 960, and they did not support the Church of the East, and so it declined very substantially within China until the Mongolians took over, and that is the Yuan dynasty in China. And so 1271, the Mongolians invade, and the Mongolians, strangely enough, were somewhat Christian. Not entirely. Like Genghis Khan himself was animistic, shamanistic, he was not a Christian. His sons ended up marrying a whole bunch of Christian women from another tribe in Mongolia that had been connected to the Church of the East for about 600 years at that point in time. So all of his Genghis Khan's daughters-in-law end up being Christian women. And they were heavily influential in the court because the men would always leave, go on conquests and invasions, and the ladies would be left at home to manage things. And so you have the Mongolian Empire that has an extraordinary amount of Christian influence, which is not what we normally think of. But then we have this golden age of the Church of the East where it ends up hitting its greatest geographic extent. And you remember ever hearing or learning about the guy by the name of Marco Polo?
Marco
Polo. Right. He's the guy we do use.
I never learned about him before,
Yep.
though.
Alright, so the swimming pool game comes from the explorer Marco Polo. He was an Italian explorer who wanted to travel the Silk Road over to China. So he takes 20 years of his life and travels into China from Italy, and he does that at the time of the Mongolian Empire, and he discovers Christians over in the Mongol Empire. And he was not expecting to find Christians over there because at that time in Europe, the only thing they knew of was Muslims over there. So he was exploring relatively unexplored territory as far as Europeans were concerned, and then all of a sudden he's discovering Christians where he didn't think they should be, or were likely to be. And this is the geographic extent of the Mongolian Empire at its height. So we'll do some geography here. So the last map we looked at was just looking at this little corner of the Mediterranean Sea here. We have Egypt down here, Ethiopia is down in this neighborhood, and Arabia is largely Muslim. The Mongolian Empire was the largest empire the world had ever seen up to that point in time, and this map shows it because, yep, it goes from Korea all the way over to Europe, and this is Lviv, Ukraine, which is the safe part of Ukraine right now where Russian missiles aren't falling that often. It includes all of Moscow, and so the Mongolians invaded the Russian Orthodox Church, all of the Armenian churches, and they essentially took all the heartland of the Church of the East. Remember, the Church of the East was based out of a city here, just north of Baghdad, that had sent missionaries along the Silk Road through Central Asia into China. The only part of the Church of the East that wasn't found within inside the Mongolian Empire was the Malabar Church, which is down here on the coast of India. And they flourished under the Mongolian Empire because they had religious freedom and tolerance. The Mongols were relatively free with that until a Mongolian emperor was converted to Islam, at least. And they had a lot of Christian influence because of their wives. And so the churches do pretty well through this period of time, and they spread quite generously. And then it hits a really hard collapse because the Mongolian Empire fractures and an invader by the name of Tamerlane takes over and sets up an empire in Central Asia. So Tamerlane was one of the greatest generals of his generation, and he invaded this huge empire in Central Asia, and he was Muslim, and so he was going to cleanse his empire of all the non-Muslims. And if you look at his map, this is the extent of his empire that he carved out of what had been Mongolian territory. And you'll see that this includes the heartland of Central Asia, where most of the Church of the East was based, and it included this area here. So he essentially annihilates the entire Church of the East at this point in time, and within his empire, the only place that it persisted was this little pocket here in Mesopotamia, northern Iraq today. Otherwise, it was all gone. At the very same time that this takes place, the Ming Dynasty takes over in China, and they were reacting against the Mongolians, who were too cosmopolitan for their liking, and so they wanted to eradicate all of the foreign religions of China. And if you remember, the Church of the East depended on church leaders getting imported from, never mind, you wouldn't remember this because I talked about it last week and you weren't here. Last week, we talked about how the Church of the East would take Persians and send them over to China to lead the church over there. They never developed any domestic Chinese church leaders. And so they were dependent on the Silk Road being open to send church leaders from Persia and Iraq over into China. And when Tamerlane cut that link, they could no longer travel over there. And then when the Chinese took over, because it was led by all these Persians, they perceived it as just being a foreign religion to exterminate, and that's precisely what they did. And so the last record of the Church of the East is a monk who is recorded to have existed in 1438. And then the Church of the East in China was vanquished and exterminated and no longer extant. The only remnants then of the Church of the East left in the entire world was that little part of northern Iraq called Kurdistan and the Malabar coast of India, where it had existed all the way back to the days of Thomas the Apostle.
Wait, the Kurds are Christian?
No, the Kurds are not Christian, but in Kurdistan there is an ethnic minority of Christians.
Okay.
Yep. It's confusing. There's such a melting pot there that you've got a lot of crazy different ethnicities melted all together. Kurds are not Christians, Kurds are Muslims. They're not cheese
That's all I'm
curds.
thinking.
I know.
What are Kurds?
They're an ethnicity that came out of Central Asia, and they moved into that period or that region probably during the Mongol Empire time frame. They're the largest ethnic group in the world that doesn't have their own country right now.
Oh.
So you'll find Kurds in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Those are the 4 countries that have a high concentration of Kurds. And I think there's like 20 or 30 million Kurds. So there's a lot of people that have a similar ethnic identity, but they don't have a country to call their own because they are subjugated by Shiites in Iraq and the Turks in Turkey and Sunnis in Syria, and whoever's ruling Iran is subjugating the Kurds there too. Anyway. So the Malabar Christians, they get discovered by the Portuguese too in 1498 when I think it was Vasco da Gama's second expedition arrived over there. They were expecting to just find Hindus, and they find Christians, and they were really surprised to find Christians over there because they didn't know they existed. So that leaves us in the year 1600 with 6 different strands of the church. You got the Roman Catholic Church, lots of different Protestant churches arising in Europe, the Eastern Orthodox Church, which has a few strands itself because the Russian Orthodox Church is somewhat independent at this point in time. You've got non-denominational pilgrim churches across Europe, in addition to the Protestant and Roman Catholic churches. You've got 4 different Oriental Orthodox churches, and you've got the Church of the East, which is now just a very small remnant of what it once was. And next week, we'll wrap up church history to today. And that'll be that. That was a lot to swallow.
Yep.
Especially with all the countries I don't know where they are.
I know.
Me too.
Sorry. I put as many maps in as I could find, but it's
Yeah.
really hard finding good maps with this content I have discovered. So we'll keep
I
working
mean,
on the
to be fair, in 8th grade history, we literally just wrote something about Romans wiping their nose.